My name is Parsons. If you're wondering what it was that I found all those years ago, nearly 20 by now, in that rotten, thrown-away place, I'll tell you. I'll even tell you how I found it. Something I've never shared with anyone. I'll let you know, not because I think you'll believe me, but because I have so little left to lose, I may as well. My involvement in the whole ordeal began when my younger sister showed up at my door completely unannounced. It was raining, and she was in terrible shape. She was disheveled and had a pathetic-looking homemade splint on her hand. She was always quite fastidious and well put together, so it was quite a shock to see her in such a state. Immediately demanding I give her a ride, she was evasive about her injuries. I all but begged her to tell me what happened, but her only greater trait than compassion was stubbornness, so I soon gave up. Adamant that we leave immediately, she insisted that I tell no one about this, tonight or in the future. Now, as odd as this was, I immediately agreed. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, I wouldn't do for my sister. We were close, yeah, but a lot of siblings are. She'd been supportive of me during a very rough time, and I owed her a great debt that I could never really repay. See, when I was young, I developed a horrible addiction to an obscure street drug called Zeppelin, a foul poison with a shockingly low recovery rate. It got really bad for me, and my behavior became so reprehensible that my parents and I no longer speak. I can't really blame them. My sister was my best friend, my only remaining family, and, I'm ashamed to say, the closest thing I had to a parent left. She never gave up on me and went to great lengths to help me get better, even went so far as to forcibly isolate me while I purged the junk from my system. The experience was absolute misery from beginning to end, but it worked. I'm not sure anything else would have. I was no longer dependent on Zeppelin and had my life back together. For that alone, I owed my sister everything. A brief road trip and a kept secret were such small things to ask. I suggested that she get some sleep and that we leave in the morning after she had had some breakfast, but she flatly refused that, stating that we had to leave right then, immediately. At night, in the middle of what was becoming a truly horrendous storm. It just couldn't wait. So we left. I drove, and she stayed in the passenger seat and directed me. Once we were on the open highway, she fell asleep a few times. When I approached an intersection or exit, I would have to wake her so she could tell me which way to go. Over time, the storm intensified. It became so violent that just staying on the road required all of my attention. The road was covered in at least an inch of standing water, and I had to drop my speed well below the speed limit to stay on it. Eventually, all my focus was woefully inadequate. I remember very little from the crash itself, but I do recall a sudden jolt and then looking up into the rainy sky. There was no road in sight, and the headlights reached out into the solid night. I sat there for some time before I realized what had happened. A tree had come down so hard onto the back of my vehicle that it had bent the car into a nearly perfect L shape. The rear of the vehicle was all but flattened to the pavement, and the front end was pointed skyward. Secure behind the seatbelt and a fully deployed airbag, I looked over and found the passenger seat empty. My sister had been ejected through the windshield. I never saw her again. I tried to find my phone and call an ambulance, but I kept losing consciousness. A passerby saw the wreck and called for help. I woke up in the hospital with a minor head injury. When I asked about my sister, they told me I was confused. It took me quite a while to convince anyone I wasn't. When I finally did, the nurse I was speaking to went real quiet. Because the windshield had been completely shattered and the seat next to me was empty, paramedics hadn't known there was a second person in the car. My sister had survived the initial crash and walked about a quarter mile down the road before succumbing to injury and exposure to the cold. Had I been awake to tell them about her, she would have likely survived. There was a brief investigation. The police, insurance, and everyone else agreed that I wasn't at fault, not in any official capacity. My role in her death weighed heavily on me, naturally. With sobriety still new to me, grief and guilt made relapse seem inevitable. I relied on deliberate and repetitive routines each day, and I really couldn't deviate or do anything unexpected or new. It caused me to react slowly and avoid interaction with anyone whatsoever. Processing grief is never quick, I don't think, but this was a slow, day-at-a-time process. There wasn't room for much else in my life. I didn't attend the funeral. Facing my parents after everything I put them through would have been impossible under any circumstance. But this, to be the cause of their remaining child's death, there was no way I could do it. There were other people there too, people that I had cut out of my life entirely. Without explanation or apology during my recovery, facing any of them was equally unthinkable, so I hid away. My trivial office job at an accounting firm was of no real concern. I was placed on leave with reduced pay, but no expected return date. This kept me from becoming homeless, but it only enabled my isolation. Months went by that way, without much change until a late-night YouTube rabbit hole snapped me out of it. The video that caught my attention had a ridiculous title, something like, True Unsolved Mysteries. Top 10 Pacific Northwest Hauntings, 100% real. Just absurd, but the thumbnail image was just something I couldn't ignore. It was a drawing of a face, in that style, you know, like a police sketch, the kind they do when someone is missing or wanted. The face was drawn with remarkable skill and had an uncanny resemblance to my sister. It was unsettling. It chronicled a series of bizarre encounters along a strip of rural highway. The same strip of highway my sister died on. As far as phantom hitchhiker stories go, it was like all the rest. The legend was that she would wave down motorists for a ride, but when she got in the car, she wouldn't say a word. She'd silently guide the drivers to a nondescript little town that inconveniently wasn't named or described. Once she got out of the car, she would walk into the darkness and vanish. There were numerous versions of the story, details changing here and there, but the road, the girl, and the non-verbal directions to an unknown place were consistent between each recounting. People following the story online had taken to calling the woman the Ghost of Telegraph Creek, a moniker that followed the story around message boards and forums. One user in the comments pointed out that fatal accidents on the road had increased over the past few months. The few months since my accident. After some online sleuthing, I discovered the drawing in the video's preview image was made after police investigated a crash that killed a driver. A surviving passenger described the Ghost of Telegraph Creek to a sketch artist. It was part of a full inquiry and subsequent search, but the strange woman was never found. When the accident first happened, all I wanted to do was put it out of my mind, to forget it and never think about it again. But now, I had so many questions. The foremost being, if this was real, was my sister's ghost wandering the roadway she died on? I retrieved a box of things the automotive salvage company had given me. My car had been completely written off, and they collected everything in it and packed up a cardboard box. After I failed to pick it up for a few weeks, they dropped it off at my house. The box sat unopened in my closet since then. It still had tape on the top seam. There wasn't much in it. My sister's clothes had been disposed of when her body was retrieved, so it was just the things we had in the back seat. Other than my uninteresting possessions, I found her purse, a jacket, and a reusable travel mug. There wasn't anything of note in her purse. The usual stuff one might find in any young woman's handbag. There was a mobile phone that I plugged in. Its battery had long since died, but so much of our lives were on our devices, even back then, I figured it was the best lead I was going to get. The only other item of note from her purse was a key. It was heavy, cold, and rusted. This key was separate from her main keyring with her house and work keys on it. It was larger, too. One of those heavy industrial ones that tended to be used on storage sheds, or maybe a marina or lighthouse. Utilitarian. The kind that could be left out in any weather and still function reliably. Without any guess as to what it might unlock, it wasn't much help, just odd. I kept the key out and packed everything back into the box. As I lifted the box to put it back in my closet, my sister's folded jacket fell out. It hit the ground with more of a thump than I expected. It occurred to me that I hadn't searched through the pockets. Assuming all of her things were in her purse, I never thought to look. Rummaging through, it appeared that I had been mostly correct. The pockets were empty, except for an inside chest pocket that was zipped shut. I opened it to discover another mobile phone. This one had a faded old zebra sticker on it. I recognized it as my sister's. That, of course, meant the phone charging in my kitchen belonged to someone else. The mystery phone had been plugged in for a bit, so I swapped them and put my sister's on to charge. I flipped it open. No iPhones back then. I didn't immediately recognize any of the contacts in it. I was about to see if the photos could tell me anything about the phone's owner. If nothing else, perhaps I could see it returned. But before I did, I noticed the small envelope icon that indicates a voicemail is waiting. I hit the 1 key and it dialed. A robotic voice stated that there were 2 unheard messages. The first, the older one, was just a hang-up, but the second was a familiar voice. It was mine. The voicemail was one I had left a while back. I knew whose phone this was. Cassandra Sturges had been friends with my sister and I since childhood. She and I had become more than friends for a brief but intense time, but I had cut ties with her when I was recovering from my addiction. She was great, but always managed to find some kind of trouble. The chaos that seemed to follow her just wasn't good for me. There were a lot of people in my life that I either alienated or distanced myself from. While I lost contact with Cassie, she and my sister remained close friends. I had called Cassie immediately after the accident, not wanting her to find out in some surprising and upsetting way. I left a message simply asking her to call me back. Contacting her had put my sobriety at risk, but I wanted to see her and honestly felt like I had nothing left to lose. Luckily for me, she never answered or returned the call. The night my sister died, she had Cassie's phone, but I had no idea why. That revelation filled me with an undeniable discomfort. Discomfort and a sense of shame as I snooped through her phone. Could the entire purpose of the drive we had taken been to return a mobile phone? It seemed absurd, but I didn't have another theory. What could have been so important about this phone that my sister insisted on leaving in the rain, in the middle of the night, with a broken hand? I looked through the photos and messages, somewhat sheepishly, but there was nothing of use. Once my sister's phone had enough charge, I flipped through it as well. There was nothing especially helpful on it either. After putting the phones away, I stayed up nearly the whole night rewatching the video and reading ideas and theories online. The whole thing had become an obsession. As immeasurable, unbelievable, and impossible as the story was, it felt real to me. The idea that my sister haunted a stretch of road in rural Canada was unshakable. I believed it was true. Perhaps only because I wanted it to be. Perhaps so I could hold on to hope, no matter how remote, that I would see her again. So, I decided the only lead left was the road itself. I would drive the roadway to the next province over and back. If I didn't see anything, I would let the whole thing go, forever. I would accept that there'd be no resolution to this whole strange affair. I would get on with my life. I woke up late the next day, brewed some coffee, and threw a few basic supplies in a bag. I was on the road by noon, and well outside the populated area soon after. The weather was bad though. Already, by mid-afternoon, it was clouding over and darkening. The road was draped in a dense fog and looked eerily similar to the night of my accident. The drive was uneventful for the next few hours until the highway wound down into a deep valley. I hadn't seen another driver in a while, and as I crested over a hill and descended the slope on the other side, there was a lot of fog and the visibility was really bad, but my headlights picked up something that was just on the shoulder of the road. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but as I got closer, I realized it was a car. The interior light was still on, and the passenger door was hanging open. It was just sitting there. Something about the scene had me very unnerved. It didn't look like an accident or anything, but it didn't look normal either. The dark sky, oppressive fog, empty road, everything had me a little rattled. The car, a long, boxy, old brown thing, was still running and was at a strange angle, as if it had pulled off the highway quickly. Rolling closer, I pulled over in front of it, and I looked for signs of a flat tire or something. But I didn't see any obvious damage. So, I got out of my car, and I remember having this overwhelming feeling of dread. Not afraid for myself, but I had a terrible feeling that anyone who had been in this car was doomed. There wasn't just one especially concerning thing, but they all added up in a way that felt wrong. I left my car running, with keys in the ignition, and walked over to the passenger side to look in. Immediately, just looking through the windows, I knew everyone in that car was dead. 2 people remained inside, a woman in the driver's seat and a man behind her in the back seat. They were so still, like they were stone statues, and looked just as heavy. The interior light wasn't that bright, so I shined a flashlight through the open doorway. They didn't look right. They were very thin, just gaunt. The clothes were loose in the shoulders and hung open around the wrists and collar. They didn't fit properly. I was certain that when these people dressed themselves this morning, they didn't look like this. The clothes had fit better, but something changed while they were on this strip of highway. Something had changed today, and now their lives were over. There was nothing that could be done. There was no way I could help, and my fear was getting the better of me. I'm not proud of it, but I told myself that I needed to stay on the road, and I left. I didn't call anyone. I didn't let anyone know. I didn't close the door or touch anything. I just got back in my car, pulled back onto the highway, and drove away. I barely looked at the road until the car was out of sight in my rearview mirror. Some part of me expected that I would see someone walking back out of the woods or just standing on the roadside, but I didn't see anyone, just an abandoned car with empty people in it. It wasn't long before I encountered a young woman walking on the shoulder of the highway. She was walking backwards. It hadn't been long since my encounter with the other car, but by my guess, she was almost 60 miles from anywhere. Maybe she had had car trouble and parked out of view, or maybe she had a ride for part of her trip, sure. But if that were the case, why would she be walking away from the city? The way she headed only took her further from civilization. There wasn't even a gas station for another hour or so, and that was driving, never mind walking. The area was quite remote. I figured it had to be her, the ghost of Telegraph Creek. This was it. Slowing the car, I rolled the window down. I remember trying and failing to keep the panic from my voice and asked where she was headed. She stopped walking but didn't speak or even look my way. I repeated the question, and she turned toward the car and bent forward at the waist to look at me through the open window. She looked like my sister, sick and frail looking though, with dark lines on her face and beneath her eyes. Her hair was the wrong color, but otherwise, the resemblance was startling. There was a manic and furtive look to her. Something about the way her mouth was pinched gave me the impression of someone watching a clock, knowing that time, for something, was running out. As if she was bracing for some inevitable pain or trying not to be sick. She looked dangerous. She looked exhausted and wet. She didn't blink. A ridiculous part of me wondered if she was my sister, and she had somehow survived the crash, but there were just so many reasons why that couldn't be. I offered a ride. She stood for a long time without moving at all. I, very slowly, reached over the passenger seat and opened the door for her. It swung open toward her, and she entered the car, but made no effort to fasten her seatbelt or close the door behind her. She moved unsteadily, as if she barely had the strength to stand, and didn't look away from my face once. The tremendous fear I felt was due to many things, But one thought I couldn't get out of my head was this. She hadn't interacted with the car in any way. I wondered if she hadn't closed her door because she simply couldn't, because, like the people in the abandoned car, she was already dead. As much as I had wanted to find the ghost of Telegraph Creek, I now wanted to be as far from her as possible. The idea of reaching past her to close her door was unthinkable. Grasping my door handle, I planned to get out and close the door from the outside, perhaps even prompting her to close it herself and proving that she was just a regular young woman, acting strangely not because she was a specter doomed to walk an empty road for eternity, but because she was tired and maybe a bit afraid. As I unfastened my seatbelt, though, she shifted in her seat. I turned to look at her and realized she was very close to my face, and her mouth was open. She wasn't doing or saying anything, just sitting there with her face very close to mine, jaw agape, staring at me. As nonsensical as this gesture was, it was an act of aggression, like a baboon baring its teeth, and I knew that if I left this vehicle, she would kill me. So I pressed the gas pedal and took off quickly, the force against the door pushing it closed, and we were off. As soon as the car went into motion, she closed her mouth and sat back in the seat. We drove in silence, and the guilt of what had happened the last time I drove a young woman down this stretch filled me. The next hour was the longest of my life. We stayed on the highway for most of that time. As we came close to an exit I had never used before, she lifted one hand and pointed down a dark road. It had no sign and was so narrow I almost didn't see it. Fearing her rage, I left the highway and continued driving down what soon became gravel and then eventually dirt. She pointed at 2 other turns as we carried on. The road was going deeper into the woods, and I feared this was a dead end. It wasn't, though. Soon, the road opened up, and I saw an old, worn, wooden sign that said Ashcroft. But some of the characters were so faded it appeared, at first, to read Ash Rot. I had never been to or heard of a place by this name. I would find out later that it had been a mining town where a sour gas fissure had been opened back in the 60s. It had to be evacuated immediately, and the toxic air eventually cleared, but the chance of it happening again was too high for mining to ever resume. Without the mining industry that supported the town, there was no reason for anyone to ever return. A true ghost town. It wasn't on any maps because it was no longer technically a town. As I slowed down, I could see that there were buildings on either side of the road. They were old and abandoned. The windows had all been broken, and foliage had overtaken the outside walls. Some buildings had collapsed entirely. The woman was looking out of her window when she suddenly turned and locked eyes with me. She was starting to look even worse than when I first picked her up. Without breaking eye contact, she raised her hand to her ear with her index finger pointing skyward, and then quickly snapped her wrist back so she was pointing directly behind her. Again, moving in such an unnatural way, it seemed like she didn't have complete control of her faculties. I stopped the car, and for a moment, feared she would react violently. But she simply turned her head to look back out the window. She left her hand pointing backwards in such a bizarre pose, it would have been almost funny if her demeanor wasn't so terrifying. Still afraid to reach past her, I exited the car and opened her door. She immediately stood up and started walking quickly, if unstably, into the town. By the time I grabbed my bag from the back seat, she was almost out of sight down the empty road's narrow streets. Catching just a glimpse of her disappearing into a single-story dwelling in the middle of the street, I had to jog to catch up. The house was in terrible repair. Each step threatened to collapse and drop me into the unknown hazards below. Nobody knew where I was. If something happened, my chances of rescue were infinitely small. My urge to tread carefully would cause me to lose her for sure, so I moved quickly. I caught up, crossing the wide main living space, only to see her disappearing from the connecting hallway into a dark kitchen. There was broken glass from the windows on the floor. She stepped across it silently, and I noticed she was barefoot. It crunched under my sneakers as I followed what appeared at first to be a small pantry. Once I looked in, though, I realized it was the entryway to a steep and narrow set of stairs leading down into a concrete basement. I couldn't see her at all anymore. The light from my flashlight didn't go very far, so I had to aim it down at the steps to make my way down. The bottom landing opened to my left into a long corridor with a low ceiling. It was a strange space. The corridor ran about 30 feet at least, and came to an end with a flat concrete wall. The space was poorly lit, with a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The girl was nowhere to be seen, not a trace. That startled me, so it took me a moment to realize that the light bulb shouldn't be on down here. The town had been abandoned for a long time. There was no power or plumbing in this house. I moved toward the dead end, only to discover a door was on one of the side walls, leading back underneath the rest of the house. It was a heavy metal door, fastened with rivets and 2 thick chains that crossed in front of it. They were secured with a thick padlock that perfectly matched the key I had found in my sister's things. There was no doubt that the key opened this door, and that the ghost had brought me here to open it. The key turned easily, and the chains fell to the floor. The instant they hit the ground, the light bulb went out with a crack, leaving only the light of my flashlight. I turned the handle, and the door swung outward. Now, the whole time I was standing in the hallway, nothing seemed familiar. It was an alien place. But as soon as I saw the inside of that door, I knew exactly where I was, and I knew exactly what I would find in the room beyond, even before I looked inside and saw all of the flies. You see, it takes about 6 days for Zeppelin to leave your system and for the horrendous withdrawal symptoms to fade. Back when my sister had forcibly locked me away while I detoxed, it had been in this room, this very room. It was where I had lived with food and water for over a week, as well as blankets, a stack of books, and a bucket with an airtight lid. Unfortunately for Cassie, my sister had never made it back to let her out. She had consumed all of the food, all of the paper in the books, and the leather from her shoes. But ultimately, it would have been dehydration that caused her to die. Her fingernails were mostly gone, and she had fractures in both of her hands and one foot. She had written in the margins of the books while she waited to die, but I burned those and never read them. A small and undeserved mercy I granted myself. From what I gather, 18 people died in accidents on the strip of highway near Ashcroft. 18 people between my sister's death and the night I secretly buried Cassie in the woods outside Ashcroft. I often wonder how many of them met that angry specter on the road, and I wonder how many of them would still be alive if I hadn't crashed my car. The ghost of Telegraph Creek brought me to the town of Ashcroft, but you know what I think? I think she isn't just one ghost, but 2. 2 women wrapped up in a connected event, each with their regrets and furies. Anger was directed out at the world and those who had harmed them, but also inwardly. I think they had regrets about the choices they made and how their lives were cut short. They had a lot of anger towards each other, I think, because of how they died, but also a lot of love that was built over a long friendship. A friendship from childhood that could be diminished but never truly erased. I think these 2 were at odds, but were also allies in equal measure, at once tormenting each other and working together in search of salvation. I don't know where they are now. I still drive the highway near Telegraph Creek sometimes to see if they're wandering the edge of those cold woods. But I don't think they are. I think they've let go of their regret and guilt, hatred and pain. It's us, the living, who are left to hold on to it. And I hold on to it for both of them.